Well, we've been talking about Descartes, and as you know, Descartes is considered to be the father of modern philosophy, but that suggests that Descartes has a legacy. So what is this legacy? What happens here? What comes from this? Well, what I want to talk to you about a little bit are some of the achievements that come from Descartes' work, but in light of those achievements, some of the questions that are also raised by virtue of them. And then I want to say how this legacy plays out. I want to say what happens with the philosophers that follow in the footsteps of Descartes, because it's these philosophers that really, I'd say, mark the main path of philosophy from, I'd say, about 1650, right around the death of Descartes, all the way up through the middle of the 18th century, so middle of the 1700s. But first, a little about what Descartes did. Let's recap. Well, for one thing, one of the things that Descartes helped achieve was helping us realize that understanding is arriving at clear and distinct ideas within a rational system. Understanding is not simply a matter of categorizing. It's not simply a matter of recognizing. It's not simply a matter of inferring, and it's not simply a matter of revealing. In order to say that one understands something, in order to say that one understands anything, one has to be able to reduce that idea through analysis to a clear and distinct idea. It is, again, like so many things with Descartes, analogous to the way in which we have to reduce mathematical activities, mathematical ideas, down into an axiom, down to some fundamental equation, some fundamental state of being. If you can get to that, you understand what it is because you understand the basic way in which it's composed and what it's built up from and how it's built. That's according to Descartes, right? Second thing that you get from Descartes is this methodological skepticism, and the radical doubt that sort of comes from this methodological skepticism. And particularly the way in which he uses it not to destroy things, but actually to pierce through illusions and really refine our thinking, to arrive and analyze what exactly is a clear and distinct idea. I've seen in the conversations that we've been having, the threads that we've been having, a lot of you guys have been shaken up by this radical doubt that Descartes has been applying in the methodological skepticism. But I think it's worth keeping in mind that, it's very much worth keeping in mind in this class, that when Descartes does that, what he's doing is actually trying to go through and produce something that is positive, that's something that's constructive. He wants to find something that is absolutely solid and build on top of it. And to some extent he has. He's found these basic ideas, these basic operations of reason that cannot be doubted because you have to invoke them in order to doubt them, right? That's what he's done, and then he's built on top of them. The doubt that he's bringing up then it's not doubt in the way that people sometimes associate doubt. It's not doubt in the sense that it's an act of rebellion or defiance against belief. And it's not doubt in the sense that it's meant to cast away everything that could possibly be known. Really, in a lot of ways, the doubt isn't all that radical, in a lot of, at least certainly in comparison to what we're going to see shortly. Instead, what it is it's a way of cutting through the illusions of sense experience, the illusions of convention, the illusions of assumption, right? That's what it's trying to do. Convention, perception, assumption. Things that can't demonstrate their nature by virtue of themselves. That's what Descartes is doing with the methodological doubt, and that's a great achievement of his because he's made doubt, he's really refined doubt into a very, very constructive thing from this. Another thing that Descartes has done is that he's established the fundamentally rational character of the world. And specifically, when Descartes talks about it being a rational character, we're talking about rational in the sense of geometry. Not even just mathematics, but geometry. Now, let me make sure we're clear on what this means. When I say geometric, I don't mean circles and squares and shapes. I guess that is something that's associated with geometry. But on a conceptual level, geometry isn't really about shapes. What geometry is about is terms of relationships, right? If you think about what it is that makes a square, it's not that it's just shaped this way. It's the terms by which each line intersects with every other line, right? And meets at a particular point. And by virtue of the way in which it meets, it produces this object. That's what makes it geometry. Not that it's shaped this way or it looks this way. You could explain geometry to a creature that could not see. You could probably explain geometry to a creature that didn't even have an understanding of space. Think about the way in which you get geometry to work within a computer program. Insofar as it can function within a computer program, does a computer have any sense of what space is? No, it doesn't. It doesn't think about what space is. It doesn't have any idea about space, and yet it's capable of operating with regard to the terms and conditions of a square, or a rectangle, or a triangle, or a circle, or a two-dimensional or three-dimensional object, because the basic axioms by which these objects inhabit space are set down even before space exists. It's that kind of thinking that Descartes is talking about. It's that kind of thinking that Descartes is trying to get to with the methodological doubt, because it is that kind of thinking, key idea here, that Descartes sees as making up the world. Now, I'm going to get to this even more in a little bit here, but it's that idea in particular, that the rational terms and conditions of the world they're not just what make up the world, they generate the world, right? They make it possible for squares and triangles and rectangles. They make it possible for the expression of space. They make it possible for things to have 2 dimensions or 3 dimensions. I mean possible. I mean there is space. There is stuff in space because there is rationality generating it. That's what Descartes is identifying. And it's from that these thinkers that follow in his legacy, a group of philosophers called the Rationalists, are going to proceed from. A couple more things that Descartes pointed out. He pointed out that the capacity for the mind to demonstrate that it is of the same nature as the world. So that not only do we recognize that the world is this rational entity, but that our minds are of the same nature of it. And when we discover in the world, when we think about the world, when we participate in the world, we are capable of doing that for Descartes, because the mind that is us, the rationality that is us, participates in what that reality is. And finally, we have this idea of the demonstration of the necessity, or at least of the possibility, depending on your point of view, of God in the world. That if we say, what is God for Descartes? How shall we think about God? And remember, we have to think about God rationally here. He says, well, we can certainly think about God as that sustaining condition for rationality itself. God is, in some ways, God is the perfection of perfections. This is what we saw in the third and the fourth meditations. But I would say something else. I don't think Descartes quite puts it this way, but I bet you could put it this way. That God is the rationality of rationalities. Right? God is what allows rationality to rationalize. And I don't mean rationalize like justified. I mean rationalize as in express reason. This is what we have. So we have enormous achievements with Descartes on these points. But as much as we have these achievements, Descartes also left us with a number of questions that came out from this. Here are some of them. Some of the questions that arose that it was left upon his intellectual descendants to have to deal with. First, we have the question, is nature, and I mean nature in the sense of, great nature as in the physical world, not just birds and trees and things like that. But is nature a completed system? Is nature finished? Is nature done? Is nature its own collection of sets and terms and axioms that make up the world? Descartes seemed to think so, and yet one wonders, is that the state that we look at with nature? Is nature absolutely complete and done and finished and absolute? This is a question that gets wrestled with, not even just during the early modern period, but all the way up through today. As a matter of fact, and this is a little bit of a footnote for you, but some of you guys have probably heard about quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and the ideas that come from that. Part of what made the breakthroughs within quantum mechanics at the beginning of the 20th century so radical is that they began questioning these ideas about whether or not the physical universe was in fact absolute and set and perfect and complete. Ideas that were more or less established, at least in the forms that they have, in the 17th century by Descartes and also, of course, by Isaac Newton. The second question that is raised by the ideas and insights that Descartes comes to. What happens to the rational mind when it isn't reasoning? One of the things that we've seen with this is that a great insight for Descartes was to say that, well, the nature of the mind is the same as the nature of the world. That the way in which we come to know about and understand and participate in the world is by virtue of using the mind and this capacity to dig deep and reason through and get into it, and we participate in it. Well, that's fine, provided the mind is in fact reasoning. But what happens when the mind is not reasoning? What happens when the mind isn't even conscious? What happens when we are in a dreamless sleep? What happens when we are infants or embryos? What happens when we're dead? What happens to the mind in all these states? If the mind disappears, are we reincarnated again? What happens to the self in these questions, right? This raises up a whole series of issues that are going to come up again and again and again. What exactly is the nature of the self if we can't say it is simply the operations of rationality, given that the way it participates with the world is through this rationality, or at least part of the way it does. A third question, and a big question indeed, is what exactly is this thing called matter? Now this is such a basic question. It's a question that we almost don't ask sometimes. But what is this? What is matter? And I mean matter, right? Like that. What is matter? Remember, we had this dualism, right? This separation between mind and matter in Descartes. And when we looked at these things, when we looked at mind, when we looked at matter, we had this strange situation where we said, well, the mind comes to know about the true nature of things through reason. And if we ask, what exactly is it that makes it even possible for the physical world to be what it is? What did Descartes discover? Well, it is this reason itself. It's this rational quality itself when we use the powers of mind to arrive at that. All right? Fine. That sounds perfectly appropriate enough, reasonable. But we still have a problem. And the problem is this. We still aren't explaining exactly what this stuff matter is. We certainly know how we know about it. We know about it through reason. But we've also established that reason isn't what matter is. Maybe reason is what makes matter possible. But it doesn't explain what matter is. What is it? This is something that we're left with, right? Another question that gets left here with Descartes. What exactly is will and what exactly is emotion? Or the term that he uses are the passions. The word emotion it's not really in the English language, or for that matter the French language at that point. But what is will and what are the passions? What are feelings exactly? This is a tricky question also, because if you look at it from the point of view of Descartes, well, on one hand, the ideas we're coming to entirely through this process of reasoning, of doubt, of reduction, of this analysis, right? of using our thinking to say, yes, these are the basic conditions by which the thing is what it is, this is how I know it. It's sort of pure, it's complete, it's sharp, but it's a very particular kind of thinking. It's a very particular kind of using consciousness. And there are, as we all know by virtue of being human beings, other ways of using consciousness. We can't exert will, what we would have to be the case, what we would force or impose and exert our energy towards in the world. We have our passions and our feelings, sadness, happiness, ennui, boredom, all the different emotions and feelings that we have, right? These states. These aren't things that we arrive at through analysis. No one thinks about it and goes, yes, indeed, I am happy. I can see that now. Look at the axiom that demonstrates it. You have, I hope you don't do that, Rain Man. I really, what you end up doing is that you have this process by which you go through and you experience and encounter and move with the world. Now, if that's the case, how? How exactly is it possible? Because we don't really have an account for that with Descartes. We know, as he says, that the scope of the will goes beyond the scope of reason. It doesn't compromise it, but reason can go this far, and the will goes this far, right? It acts out in the world and it acts beyond the parameters of reason. Reason has to sort of build its way forward to the scope of will. And this is why will is sometimes seen as a dangerous thing for Descartes, because will is acting willy-nilly, so to speak, without reason at certain points, and it needs to be mastered by it, according to Descartes and according to the rationalists. But what exactly is it? And what's its relationship to reason? Because this is what we're left with. And finally, the last question we're left with is around God. A number of thinkers said that Descartes was helpful in certain ways in talking about God. Because what Descartes did was, by pointing out that God is sort of the condition for the possibility of perfection, right? Or as I've been saying, the rationality within reason itself, that there is a way in which we can think of the possibility of God. But there isn't really any demonstration of the necessity of God through reason. Now this doesn't necessarily create problems for Descartes, because for Descartes he can say, well, then leave it to the Catholic Church. And that works out just fine because it gives him a great deal of protection. A number of you were asking in the threads, how was it that Descartes was not in trouble with the church during this time, given the radical doubt that he brought up? This is part of the reason how. He gives all sorts of authority to the church because he says, look, I'm simply putting reason forward up to this point, up to this possibility. That's as far as I go with it. But for philosophers, this doesn't necessarily do that much. So you've demonstrated God as a possibility, rationally. All right? It's something to consider. But it doesn't really solve any problems, especially if you're looking at the kind of rigor rationally as you want to do. So these are the achievements of Descartes, and these are the problems of Descartes. Where do we go from here? Well, I'll tell you. It is unfortunate that this course is only over a month. If we had more time, one of the things that we would do is we would spend a little time reading some of the great rationalist philosophers that follow in the footsteps of Descartes. There are many through the 17th century that do this, but there's two in particular that I try to have us read whenever I do this course over a full semester in this room, as a matter of fact. And these thinkers are Baruch, or Benedict Spinoza, who lived from 1632 to 1677, a beautiful and intricate and very difficult thinker in many ways, in his work, The Ethics in particular. And then also another philosopher, a philosopher that is going to come up in large part because we are going to be looking at him through the eyes of Voltaire, a philosopher named Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, lived from 1646 to 1677, or to 1716, excuse me. I think what I'd like to do here, given that we have other thinkers to talk about too, and so much territory to cover with this, is I'd just like to give three really basic themes that come up with regard to trying to talk about how these questions that were left by Descartes were answered by these later thinkers. Thinkers like Spinoza, thinkers like Leibniz, and then others. Malebranche, Groundings, Arnold Groundings, other thinkers like this. First, these thinkers, Spinoza, Leibniz, Groundings, these rationalist philosophers, came to have the idea that it was reason itself that generates the physical world. Now this is kind of a radical idea for us, but I think in the 20th century, the late 20th century, and certainly the 21st century, we might begin to be able to be in a better position to understand it, because we live in a cybernetic age. Let me explain what I mean. You remember this question I was asking earlier that Descartes leaves us with. What exactly shall we say matter is, and how is it even possible, given the mind-body dualism that he's talking about? The way that it's possible is that the very notion, the very sense, the very character of materiality itself, of stuff, is only possible because rationality, because these principles of ratios, and there's not really a good word in English, so I'm going to have to make something up, but making sense-ness, right? Meaningfulness of things is generated by rationality itself. The comparison I would make to it is this. Think about a very complex video game or a computer program. Think about World of Warcraft. I've got a lot of students who love World of Warcraft. I mean, they spend all their time on this, right? And they go around and they're venturing around. They're flying around on griffins and fighting night elves, and there's a dragon, I guess, that just came up and he's been attacking things. They tell me about all this stuff. It's very exciting. And one of the things that's so exciting about it is that there's just this world to go through and explore and beautiful things. All this stuff is there, right? But here's the thing. That world, that magnificent, wonderful world that they're participating in and learning in and enjoying and interacting with, it's all generated. It's all generated by a program. And what's the program? Well, here's the thing. The program it's not matter. What does the program come down to? The program is a series of very, very intricate, complicated electrical charges running through a particular environment, and they're running through it with a pattern. And it is that pattern, that mathematical pattern, right? That program that makes it possible for this wonderful World of Warcraft to exist, and for this wonderful world that my students and all these people are participating in and playing in. It generates that world, in other words, right? The computer program generates that world. Well, in the same way that the computer program, and I mean the code of the program, generates the possibility of that world and everything in that world, so it is that the code of the real world generates the possibility of it being. Again, it's not so strange when you try to think about the world on a more basic level than we often do. Here, let me give you one more little thought experiment with this. You might say, reason, rationality, that's great, that's highfalutin stuff, I'm glad I'm taking this philosophy, but come on. Physical world, right? Okay. Here. A piece of chalk. You know what I'm going to do with this? I'm going to break it in half. I'm going to do it again. Break it in half. Now, I'm not strong enough to continue breaking in half, but I could. I'll pretend. I'll break it in half, I'll break it in half, I'll break it in half, I'll keep breaking it in half. At some point, with the chalk here, I would get down to chalk molecules. At some point, within the molecules, I get down to atoms. At some point, within the atoms, I get down to breaking the atom apart. In addition to unleashing a nuclear explosion, I would also have protons and electrons and neutrons. I'd have quarks. I'd get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And at some point, this thing, whatever we would call it, that sustains the possibility of this, matter, stops acting like matter. It stops taking up space. It acts more like energy. It acts more like a set of relationships. And let me tell you, once you're talking that way, it's a set of relationships, we're down Rationalist Road. So these guys are not so crazy as you might think, right? This is one direction that they're going with it. The physical world is generated by rationality itself. This leads to something else. Very important idea. It's going to come up with Voltaire, comes up with Kant, with Hume, with all the people we're thinking of. That these ideas work because there is a way in which the rationality sort of plays upon itself. It yields the possibility of this whole program, as it were, unfolding and allowing identity to be. It is, and this is a term that is used by Links in particular, but Leibniz is the one who picks it up and makes it famous, a pre-established harmony. A pre-established harmony. In other words, the rationality of these ideas creates the best of all possible worlds. A term that I'm sure, if you've looked through Candide, you've seen mocked by Dr. Pangloss, or in Dr. Pangloss, about 1,000,000,001 times. So, this is another thing that comes from it. Reason in generating the physical world generates it in a meaningful, established, harmonized way, and that whatever happens, happens because it's part of the program, because it's required, because it's part of this pre-established world. Another thing that comes up, and this really comes up much more after Descartes. This comes up in particular with the philosopher Spinoza, although in a way he is drawing off of some ideas that were established by very much earlier thinkers, in particular a group of thinkers, ancient thinkers called the Stoics, picked this up quite a bit. Because human beings are what they are by virtue of this rationality, human beings are literally extensions of reason. We are what we are through reason. I mean, this is maybe one of the tricky things to see here, but you have to keep in mind, if reason is generating the world, if the physical world is an extension of these rational forces at work, and we participate in this world by virtue of our power to think through it, this reason that we're dealing with, is it ours? Well, yes and no. It's certainly ours in the sense that we participate in it and we access it, but we are not simply the reason in our own minds. As a matter of fact, and this is especially true with Spinoza, someone who, again, I would have you read if we had more time, there is a way that the way in which we fully realize who and what we are, indeed, the way in which we come to be free human beings, to fully be what we can be, is when we use reason to recognize ourselves in the totality of the world, to recognize our place within this rational expression, this great gigantic program called the world, called reason, called the event that is things, right? So human beings are literally extensions of this rationality, and our understanding of the world is the way in which we are real in the world. We find our freedom through this reasoning. Now you might say, well, that sounds great, but I like to think that my freedom comes through being able to do what I want to do, being able to exercise my free will, being able to feel and do and think and pursue what I want to do. Well, let me tell you what the rationalists say about this. Again, especially Spinoza, but certainly Leibniz, a lot of these thinkers coming out of Descartes are saying from this. What they'll say is, look, if you go and simply exercise your quote-unquote freedom by exercising your will, you know what you're doing? You're unfreeing your freedom, basically. You're binding your freedom. And I'll tell you why you're binding your freedom. The way that you're free is by being real in the world, right? It's by realizing everything you can be in the world, yeah? Well, if what makes you real in the world is rationality, why would you want to do something that doesn't engage that? What is it that could possibly do? The way in which you find this freedom, or the rationalist, the way in which you come to be free, is by using your reason to participate in the world, not to just sort of let yourself go. It's using reason to master the will. It's using reason to look through the passions, to look through the things that affect us, to look through your feelings and see them for what they are. When you can see the world clearly, when you can see what you are and what you feel and everything that happens in every single thing around you because of the power of reason, when you can see that, when you can do that, then and through that, you have discovered freedom. That is how you come to be free, right? Freedom is not just doing what you want. Doing what you want is a way to bind yourself in the world because it separates you, or at least obscures you from what ultimately is real. The rationalists are not the only ones to make this point. Like I said, the Stoics make this point. If you ever read further philosophy, the absolute idealists like Hegel make this point. But, and there are others, certainly there's thinkers in Asian thought, Indian philosophy, Brahmanical thought, Shankara talk about these ideas too. There's a lot of thinkers who have recognized this. But I don't know if there's a lot of people that make it more forcefully with regard to reason than the rationalists like Spinoza, like Leibniz, and to some extent even like Descartes. And then finally, one last thing that comes from the legacy of this, from the rationalists coming out of Descartes, is the way that this philosophy, this rationalism, proceeds into science. Remember, what we have in the 17th century is what many historians of ideas call the century of genius. I mean, this is the century when this vast numbers of discoveries about the natural world are really beginning to take shape. I mean, and this is changing the way people think about what the cosmos is. I mean, I don't know if it's that easy to quite get in this day and age, but you have to recognize what it must have been like to realize that there were planets that were billions of miles away. Think of what billions of miles mean when you can recognize that. And the furthest that you've ever traveled from your home is 40 miles on foot, or once when you were 17 on a horse. You know, I mean, think about what that would mean if you could really come to understand that. That would be extraordinary, right? I mean, this is an earth-shaking thing. You think these questions are knocking on your brain. Think about what it is for them. Well, this is what you're facing at this time. And rationalism, because of all these scientific discoveries, and rationalism just, boom, it augments those ideas like nobody's business, right? In particular, the way in which it does this is that rationality becomes a way for science not so much to discover, but to recover ideas. Remember what we were just saying, what comes out of the rationalists, that the world is generated through reason. It's literally generated through reason, right? It's coming up into being through reason, and these different sort of systematic approaches to this. If that's the case, then for the rationalists, what one observes in the world, however helpful that might be in understanding its nature, is really secondary. Because the reality of it is already there. This is just a shortcut or a path to it, right? A little easier way to get to it. What science is about is not observing. It's not really about learning. It's about recovering. It is no accident at all that in the 17th century you see science first coupled with mathematics. You might not realize this, but prior to the 17th century, mathematics was much, much more closely associated with religion. Way over there, right? Science, such as we think about it, empirical observations, was based on the physical senses, on what we see and encounter that way. In the 17th century, largely because of rationalism, largely because the natural world is reduced into this way of rationally thinking about things, the two are coupled together. And from that, the advancements of Newton, the physical breakthroughs, things that shape our thinking today, they're worked out. So this is the legacy of Descartes and the rationalists in the 17th century, some of them.